So welcome everyone. It is my pleasure today to introduce Maciej Grotowski, who is visiting from Poland, where he is at the Academic Center for Strategic Analysis at the War Studies University in Warsaw, a think tank that was founded by the Ministry of Defense in Poland, where he works on policy analyses and strategic reports for decision makers in the Polish government. He has authored articles on the methodology for estimating economic and social costs of corruption, and has also contributed to the design of a community policing initiative that has enabled citizens to collaboratively map dangerous areas in their neighborhoods. He is currently the project leader of a national research grant entitled The New Civic Service Model for Poland, which explores the design of modern civic service institutions. And so we are very happy to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Ivana, for a kind introduction, and thank you for having me. I would like to express my gratitude to the Center for Russia, Eastern Europe and Eurasian Studies for this opportunity. I'm glad to be here with you today. But before I begin, I'm obligated to disclaim that views and expressions presented in this lecture are of the author and does not necessarily represent the official policy and statement of my employer, War Studies University, the main Polish military academy. As Ivana stated, I currently hold the position of an expert and a principal investigator at the Academic Center for Strategic Analysis, where we prepare analytic reports for our decision makers. So let's move to today's agenda. I will start with a short explanation why I choose this topic, why it is important for me, and why I assume that it would be interesting for you as well. Then I will indicate a few epistemic challenges which occur when it comes to Russia. After that, I will shortly sketch the conceptual framework that will help us understand the described phenomena. Then I will finally cover the main topic of this presentation, which is the process of the remilitarization of Russian youth, with a particular emphasis of the Armia case. After that, I will propose a few interpretations and explanations how to understand the described phenomena. And finally, I will cover what all does that mean from the point of view of the security environment in Eastern Europe and beyond.
So from the point of view of the security concern, right now Russia is our top one priority. On the one hand, Russian officials, Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin himself, sometimes they declare that they are in confrontation with NATO right now. And the third, more deeper confrontation is likely. On the other hand, Western decision makers they declare that there are credible intelligence reports that say that Russia is preparing for the next war, that Russia is secretly deploying new military units near NATO neighbor countries. So we should assume that there is something in this declaration. But to confirm these statements, we could observe the rising mobilization in military spending in European countries. So we try to anticipate what the next conflict will look like, and to achieve that we are focused on the younger generation, because by studying what's going on with the youth, you can say what the future conflict could look like, because those youths who are today's teenagers, in a few years will be soldiers, military leaders, and decision makers. But when it comes to Russia, there are a few epistemic challenges. First, that is worth to mention is that obtaining reliable and valid data is challenging, because currently in Russia there is no freedom of speech; it is highly limited. You can go for 15 years to the jail by spreading so-called disinformation about Russian army and special military operations. So it is challenging to have discussions and to obtain relevant data in Russian sources. And moreover, in Russia there is a state-controlled media monopoly. So even at the level of the state, you cannot always believe with the official media reports. And there is a social phenomenon of self-censorship known during the Soviet era, where ordinary citizens, public intellectuals, or journalists limit themselves in sharing their private views and attitudes. So the lack of necessary data is challenging. But there is another more profound problem, is the problem with proper interpretation of this data. Sometimes even on the level of a popular digital culture, there is a popular hashtag, Russia State of Mind. It is sometimes attributed to the bizarre, strange videos showing people interacting with peers as with pets, showing acts of violence, people acting bizarrely, hardly to imagine in other cultural contexts. But 1.5 century ago, a well-known Russian poet, Fyodor Tyutchev, wrote a short poem, Умом Россию не понять. How many of you are familiar with this poem? Please raise your hand. Not that many? Okay, so let me elaborate a bit more about it. So the poem goes like this. One cannot comprehend Russia with his or her mind, and cannot measure it with a standard yardstick, because Russia has its uniqueness, and you can only believe it. And usually, this short poem is considered as a warning toward Westerners. Don't you dare, Westerners, to interpret Russia with your Western terms and lenses. You will understand nothing. Russia is beyond your scales. Okay? But in my opinion, this is not a valid approach, because if you look carefully at the last line, in Russia you can only believe. It suggests that Russia is incognizable at all. It is a manifestation of a cognitive pessimism. And you know what? Even ordinary Russians, sometimes, on a daily basis, when they encounter a specific, particular challenging situation, they say, bez wodki nie pojmiesz, or bez wodki nie rozbierzesz, which literally means you cannot comprehend that without having a bottle of vodka. What does that mean? In order to get it right, you have to intentionally limit your cognitive capacities. The more you try to understand, the less you get it right. So before you start thinking that you are not smart enough to get something right, actually the opposite is true. You are too smart. Or you just didn't get enough vodka today. Okay, let's move on. 3 weeks ago, we had a meeting in Warsaw with William Courtney, a Russia specialist from RAND Corporation, and he said that when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, West in general, or the United States in particular, committed 2 huge strategic misassessments. They overstated Russian pro-Western drive, or at the same time underestimated the Ukrainian pro-democratic drive. We ended with lack of necessary support and make a weak stance against Russia's imperial ambitions. And we can add to that when it comes to China, Western allies and decision makers commit similar strategic misassessments by overlooking the growing power and impotence of China, because their attention of the United States were too much focused on the Middle East at that time, because American taxpayers' money were aggressively invested in an attempt to make Middle East societies more democratic, more free market economies, which didn't end well. That's why we have to focus more when it comes to proper understanding of different cultures and different civilizations. And that's why I think the important role of the Center for Russia, Eastern Europe, and Emerging Studies is so crucial to deliver knowledge and skills to avoid future strategic misassessments. Conceptual framework. So my perspective is rooted in the military sociology and the process of militarization, which is considered very broadly. It's a very wide concept. And in military sociology, there is an assumption that you can study the mutual relations between the civilian world and the armed forces, because there are mutual interconnections. And if you want to know how the future army will look like, you have to look at the contemporary society, and in particular on the younger generation, because it will tell how the future soldiers and military leaders will look like and how they will behave. And when it comes to the term of militarization, there are at least two major approaches in understanding this term. The first approach, I would call it structural. It assumes that militarization is just a growing role and importance of military society. And the other approach, we can call it diffusional or cultural. It says that militarization is a diffusion of military practices and means into the civil world. And when it comes to Russia, both of those approaches are valid. But when it comes, for example, for Finland, rather the first one. In Finland, there is a big role of a military society, but without the militarization as a process of incorporating the civilian world needs. And why I indicated in the title of this presentation that we are speaking about re-militarization. What does this prefix means? Well, I would argue that during the Soviet era, the Soviet Union was a quite militarized society. There was a myth, there existed a myth or even a cult of the Red Army heroes who helped to protect Russia or even the entire world from the Nazi Germany. And there was a huge amount of military spending during that time. Officially 15%, according to more independent estimations, even 28% in the 80s. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia experienced a temporary initial demilitarization period, the so-called wild 90s, the Yeltsin era, where Russian armies didn't succeed in Afghanistan, in both Chechenian wars. The end of the 90s in Russia were associated with economic crisis, lower military spending. And after that, after the year 2000, when the Yeltsin was replaced by Putin, we could observe a gradual remilitarization, growing importance of military in Russian society. And I would argue that after the year of 2022, after the full-scale invasion of Russia and Ukraine, we could observe an accelerated hyper-remilitarization. So from now on, I would like to basically cover, I would like to address three questions. First, how are Russian youth being remilitarized? Second, why are Russian youth being remilitarized? And what all that mean from the point of view of the security architecture in Eastern Europe? Okay, so the remilitarization attempts didn't occur recently, they occurred after the year 2000. And we could find in the state documents, in the state patriotic education programs, which covered 5-year periods from the year 2000 to the year 2025. In the first that 5-year period, Russian officials stated that there is a need to create a network of patriotic youth clubs, military youth clubs, and sport youth clubs. So because of that, we can assume that this remilitarization didn't occur from scratches. It is a part of the more long-term strategy of remilitarization of the society. And there were a few attempts to create a Russian massive patriotic youth movement. In particular, after the year 2004, there was a great fear among Russian establishment that something similar to the Orange Revolution that took part on the Ukraine can spread in Russia. So they created a Youth Democratic Anti-Fascist Movement, ours, Nashi, to help teenagers to be not so likely to create something similar to what occurred in Ukraine. And we could also indicate other initiatives. In my presentation, creation of an army is particularly important, which I will cover in specific details later. But let me right now only indicate the creation of a movement of the first. It is addressed to younger children. It is not that military, but still it is patriotic. And of course, the name suggests the tradition, the legacy of the Soviet pioneers. So you can see that Russia is slowly but steadily turning to the well-known traditional means and strategies from the Soviet era, but without the communist ideology. And in the year 2015, Russians built in Kubinka, near Moscow, Park Patriot. It is a militaristic Disneyland, where visitors can look at the SCAD ballistic missile launchers, they can touch military vehicles and other attractions. And what is most interesting for me is that they built a building, a replica of the German parliament that is on the bottom of the screen. And as Russian officials declared, it is for the purpose of the historical reenactment, to allow Russians to experience how it was to be a Red Army soldier when they were storming German parliament in 1945. But as British journalists from Guardian magazine realized and took notice, the dome on the roof of this building is contemporary, it's not historical. Historically, this dome was solid, and now it is made from glass and steel, so it is pretty concerning. And after the year 2022, we could observe in Russia accelerating militarization. And there were a few aspects of that I want to cover. First, they introduced the legislation against spreading fake news. I already mentioned that you can go for a 15-inch rail, for example, for pacifist discussions for protesting for peace on Ukraine. In fact, the sentences are actually a few months long, and there are financial fines for those that try to discuss the current course of the military special operation in Ukraine. Also, Russians launched in schools the program of important conversations. Those are meetings of teachers or invited guests with students and pupils who explain to them what is the current policy, what's going on in Ukraine, and why we as young citizens should support our ruling party. Moreover, there are increased events for participation for students in patriotic events, which is incentives, which can allow us to suspect that the organic participation is not enough. And Russian Duma plan to write textbooks to erase discussions, to erase different views on historical events, and to make them more homogeneous. It also can remind us something that was present during the Soviet era. And 2 years ago, Russians also introduced in school a Soviet-style military training for 17 and 16 years old students. And a year ago, they also reintroduced standardized school uniforms for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I have to mention that those uniforms are more civil-like, not that militaristic, standard, classic navy and white uniform. But still, this kind of uniformization is also something that is specific for militarization of the society, these units. Another aspect of this accelerated or hyper-militarization after the year 2002 were many initiatives which aim to engage Russian youth to support the aggressive propaganda of the state related to the special military operations. There were attempts to encourage children to make photos where they are making formations that are similar to the letter Z, which was the official symbol of the invasion. They were campaigning to encourage younger children to write a letter of support to veterans to enhance their morale. There were many other initiatives. Particularly interesting is that Russian Orthodox priests were visiting schools to offer spiritual support for children whose parents went to war, and that the students of vocational schools were also forced to make military equipment that is necessary on the special military operation. And there are also some credible media reports that say that teachers were required to pay about 10% of their earnings to enhance the military fund of the special operation. There were also some interesting phenomena occurring in the discourse. This discourse after the year 2022 was highly brutalized, aggressive. Special operation from Ukraine were interpreted or presented as a holy war because Nazism efforts to stand against Nazis. There were also dehumanizing efforts to portray Ukrainians as non-humans in the media, or as a vermin, yes, because it is easier to kill someone that is not a human. Yes. Also, there was also spread of the ideology of anti-Westernism. Western was called as a corrupt, as spiritually empty. Western ideologies were described as harmful. Feminism, LGBT, wokeness, liberalism, and consumerism, terrible things. Yes, we have to stand against as Russians. We are pure and want to purify more, so we have to mobilize ourselves against it. And what is also interesting is that because after the invasion of the year 2022, many more moderate Russians left the country. They are still writing from the exile, comments in the internet, Russian language internet, and they are entering into discussions with those who are still in Russia. So the temperature of this polarization is really hot because there is no middle stance. Yes, there is either you are for or you are against. So it is hard to achieve any consensus in this discussion. This is very aggressive, very brutalized discourse. And I highly recommend you the book of the American journalist Ian Garner, who wrote a book 2 years ago, Generation Z, about this brutalized discourse. He made a comparison that this looks just as anti-Jewish Nazi propaganda from the 30s. There are many similarities between these two discourses. Okay, so finally, we reach our main topic of interest, which is UNAMIA. The full name of this organization in the translation means All Russia National Military Patriotic Social Movement Association and Army. It was established a week ago, I suppose. Russia celebrated the 10th anniversary of creation of UNAMIA, which technically began operating a year later. The organization is founded and affiliated with the Ministry of Defense and supported by DOSAVs. What DOSAVs are? Those are Soviet-era voluntary associations of citizens for preparation for help for army, aviation, and navy. And they are important because even though their origin is Soviet-era, they remain highly active and they possess access to firearms, to shooting ranges, to military equipment. So Russians didn't have to create the army from scratch. They were able to merge some of the existing organizations, or either DOSAV or Young Patriotic Clubs and Young Patriotic Sport and Military Organizations, into an umbrella organization, which is UNAMIA. And please have a look at the logo of the organization. It is Soviet Corps style, aggressive looking, strong eagle, yes, with a red star, and the army. So it is a very clear message of what is the style and the aim of this subject. So when it comes to funding, UNAMIA is mainly funded by military of defense, with important support of the state-owned entities, media houses or banks. And it is important that 2 years ago, at least until 2 years ago, until recently, an important role in funding UNAMIA was played by the network of the Prigozhin and Wagner Group, but because of its assassination, that's no longer valid. But, for example, there are some credible media reports that say that so-called patriotic business is made around UNAMIA supplies, uniform production, merchandise, and so on, and that Wagner Group played until recently important role in this patriotic business. And when we take a look at the budget of the UNAMIA, we could see that this budget doubled in this year, which really shows us that Russian officials are highly motivated to make this movement massive and make a good development of the UNAMIA.
So UNAMIA is a
UNAMIA is a paramilitary organization for members aged from 8 to 17 years old. When they reach 18, they can be alumni or they can be instructors for younger peers. Membership is technically voluntary, but in fact there is a pressure to join. For example, parents of the military personnel, public officials, and similar, they receive memorandum from the Ministry of Defense that there is an expectation for their children to join. And in many instances, for example, in the smaller cities and province, sometimes Armia is the only one cultural offer for Russian youth to join. There are no other organizations, peer organizations that allow them to make something valuable. So even though there is no direct pressure, there is indirect pressure to join. Usually, regional chapters are led by former siłowiki or other military veterans, sometimes teachers, sometimes sport instructors. Member of Armia has uniforms, you can see on the slide, but there are variations in these uniforms. There are different variations for different periods of the year, for different seasons, and there are some variations in color. Most popular is khaki color with a red shirt and a red beret, but there are also blue shirts and blue berets. There are some variations, but usually the most common picture of an armist is dressed like that on the picture. When you will see the celebration of the National Victory Day, which is on the 9th of May every year, there are huge parades on the Red Square in Moscow. There are members of the Armia that are usually dressed in khaki and red uniforms. At the beginning, Armia offered mostly after-school activities for children, sometimes also weekend activities. Right now, after the year 2020, there are Army houses near the regional headquarters that offer more various kinds of activities and training. And it is usually supported by existing military associations, Russian Cossacks, Naval School, Suvorov Military School. So there is huge cooperation between existing before Armia military-like or sport-like entities. How big Armia is? The short answer is we are not sure. According to officially presented data on their web page, in the bottom left corner of the screen, we can see that there are 1.82 million members in 89 regional headquarters, but we should be skeptical to these numbers. We are not sure whether those are formal members, active members, and we could assume that Russian authorities are motivated to present a bigger success than it actually is. Me and my colleagues, we try to compare this data, this officially presented data, with our own estimations based on the number of downloads and active users of the UnArmist mobile, which is an app that helps UnArmia members to communicate with each other and to organize around national celebrations. And according to the data from the mobile app stores, there are around 100,000 downloads. Okay, but this is not a perfect indicator because when, for example, 8-year-old Russians from province, they probably has no digital device on which they can download and install mobile app. So this indicator is not perfect, but it shows us that that we just have to be cautious when we see these numbers. Let not be mistaken with these numbers. What matters is the pattern, and the pattern is clear. That Russian authorities are motivated to present UnArmia as a big success, as a massive movement. But as I stated before, the initial increase in the number of members was partially caused by the fact that the existing organizations merged under the UnArmia umbrella. And in the year 2021, Russian authorities stated the aim that they want the number of UnArmists reach 3 million in the year 2030. We are not sure if they will succeed in this aim, but it still presents that there is a big hope to make this movement as massive as it could be. And the formal head of the UN Army's main staff is Nikita Nagorny, a well-known sports celebrity who is a two-time golden medal winner at Summer Olympics in gymnastics. And we again should ask if this young guy has experience, education in leading such a big and complex institution. Of course not. Probably he is a public face whose main aim is to attract young members. If you join an army, you can be almost as cool as he is. Okay, in the year 2023, Vladimir Putin, in his Call show Direct Line, according to one of the questions that he got, he quoted Otto von Bismarck, a 19th century Chancellor of Prussia, who once said that, quote, wars are not won by generals, but by school teachers and parish priests. We have already covered the role of schools and school teachers, so let's move to the priests. And Russian Orthodox Church highly supports any effort of Russian authority, either it is for or against religious amendments and so on. And Russian Orthodox priests usually take part during UN Army ceremonies. On the left side of the screen you can see Russian Orthodox priest who is blessing children during their joining the army of celebration. And on the right side you can see UN Army members that take part in the religious celebration in a church. They pose new icons, sacred paintings on wood, and they wear UN Army uniforms. So we can see that this is some kind of reciprocal support. Which side? The strategic move of an army is to utilize digital solutions and to utilize gamification as a strategy to attract youth. If you enter the official website of an army and you want to join the organization, you can see that there are different roles you can play. You can be an athlete, you can be a creator, you can be a researcher, and a guardian or a protector. So, being a young army is like a game. It is fun. It is something that is that's familiar for you from the RPG games. It can be a warrior, a mage, a thief, a bard, and so on. And by clicking Join Your Army Now, your identity can change. You are no longer a demon or time for problems. Right now, you are a guardian, and that is a thing. So it is quite smart move to offer an archetype that you can choose, which can reshape your identity further. And UN Army basically offers a patriotic education during which in after-school classes UN Army members learn about the glorious history of Russian Army, about its past victories, and they can feel somehow connected with the ancestors who were so brave and took a part in stopping the German Nazi from overtaking the world. And moreover, they offer a basic military training. They practice with firearms. At the beginning, they practice with air pellet guns, but soon they will have more field-like training with airsoft guns, and after that they will finally get access to genuine military-grade handguns. They also took part in shooting competitions, marksmanship competitions, in competitions of disassembling and reassembling Kalashnikovs and so on. So there is a part of strict military training. They also practice military drill and discipline. They make formations, which is quite useful if they lately take part in national celebrations, because this is the place when they can show and they learn abilities in drill and discipline. And they also practice the standard scouting-like activities: survival, first aid, camping, building shelters, finding roads, and so on. And at the end, it is worth to mention that they are also engaged in charity and civic engagement initiatives. For example, they are spending their time productively committing to some kind of mutual common interest or mutual goal. So they are also helpful in that way. They help elders, orphans, they support veterans. There are also some activities that occur abroad. Army chapters are present in 4 foreign schools that are near the Russian emphasis. The countries where they operate are Italy, Belarus, Angola, and United States. There are also some credible media reports about collaboration with army and similar organizations, for example in Belarus. There is also important and very sad problem of the army activity on occupied territories on Ukraine. We'll cover that a bit. There is recent journalist investigation from the Kyiv Independent that say that this problem is quite widespread, that Ukrainian children are forced to join an army in indirect way, because right now on the occupied territories there are very poor living conditions. So for Ukrainian children joining army and some hope for a military career sometimes is enough incentives to join the army, and they will in the future will be forced to fight with the foreign neighbors. And this practice was already present in the 17th century, where Turk Ottomans forced Christian children to convert to Islam, and they have been training them for being fierce and fanatic warriors, the Janissaries. Okay? But there are many uncertainties and blind spots. As I said, when it comes to Russia, there is a problem of data gaps, and there is a problem with the truer interpretation of the gathered material. We are still not sure how big an army is, how diverse it is, what is gender balance, and we are not sure how effective it is. We assume that being trained for a military purpose in the young age could be efficient, yes, could result to better preparation of the entire generation to become more skillful soldiers, but we are just not sure. We haven't seen any effect of that. Moreover, we should assume that there is some potential of unintended consequences and backlash. That this very aggressive militarization, this aggressive indoctrination can bring the opposite results. In social sciences, there is a notion of the perverse effect, where rational decisions at the individual level could bring the opposite level at the level of the society. So we are just not sure. We are concerned, we are afraid that the more likely outcome is that the entire generation of young Russians will be skillful warriors in the next few years, but we are not sure. Okay, so what are the implications for Russia? So this very aggressive political indoctrination can result in a political radicalization. Moreover, there's also a potential that it could cause a so-called siege mentality. It is a mental approach where everyone around is potentially perceived as an aggressor, yes? Especially foreigners, yes? They can harm us, so we have to be cautious. It could also bring Soviet-era nightmares, just like epidemic of mistrust, denunciations. It could also result in some way of resistance, of resilience, where citizens could no longer bear with this atmosphere, with this vibe of constant aggression and brutalization, and they start to hide their true approaches to their private life. They do not share their own views no longer, but they are in indirect way sabotaging the efforts of the contemporary Russian authorities. But the most trivial outcome of this rapid aggressive militarization, it will be probably a big Soviet-style mass infantry army, ready to deploy it, and with an accelerated program that will be very easily subordinated to mobilization when it will be necessary. And that's why we think that by this remilitarization efforts, Russia is indeed preparing for the next long military conflict. And of course, the dark side of this militarization is that it is for sure a waste of time from the point of view of the modern economy. Is this disassembling and reassembling some rifles somehow enhancing the productiveness or the innovations? Of course not. So maybe it is a waste of time. Maybe a more productive way would be by teaching innovation or entrepreneurship. Okay, if I finally cover the topic of remilitarization in the army in particular, and I would like to propose a few interpretations. If you would like to move this presentation into the higher level of theoretical sophistication, why not? Instead of asking why Russia is remilitarizing right now, we could ask why historically countries even demilitarize at all. And this problem is sometimes called the paradox of delegated force. And it was in a very brief and elegant way stated by law historian Stephen Holmes from the New York University, who wrote in his paper Lineages of the Rule of Law. So let me quote: "Why do people with guns obey people without guns?" Okay, very good question. And the standard answer sometimes is associated with the other quote attributed to different historical figures, Napoleon, Talleyrand, or already mentioned Bismarck. Okay, so the quote is, "You can do anything with violence except sit on them," which literally means that violence could be used to obtain power, but it's not enough for legitimacy. Okay, so if the only way you can exert your order is to threaten someone, it will be very costly and it will not take a long time until someone will break your power. So in case of Russia, we could ask why during the 90s Russia experienced a shallow and temporary demilitarization, and why not remilitarization. And my hypothesis is that demilitarization in the 90s in Russia didn't succeed. It didn't fulfill its promise to deliver a sustainable development and to deliver the stable position of the military and armed force personnel. It was just not beneficial enough for them. So that's why they come back to militarizing the country in a Soviet era style. And there is a quite old concept, the garrison state, coined by a sociologist, political scientist, Harold Laswell, who analyzed the course of the 1930s countries, Asian and European countries, and coined the term of the garrison state to describe what he observed. And garrison state is just a highly militarized state, led by specialized in violence. And I think that this concept very well described what's going on right now in Russia. Okay? So we could assume that there are very much profound similarities beyond the militarization of youth that will also occur in Russia. We could also probably experience a different course of events. Okay, maybe I will skip a few less important issues, because now I see that my time is passing faster than I thought it would be. Okay, there are other layers of militarization beyond such military purpose. Okay, there are other functions. I will briefly indicate them. So, militarization can be interpreted as a response to youth crisis. Probably most of you know, in many developed countries, there is a huge increase in mental disorders among youth, in suicide attempts, in lack of sleep, and so on, in obesity. And remilitarization can be just a healthy way to organize productive time spent offline. It could also serve as a way to pursuit of digital sovereignty, because it will prevent children from being too much reliable on the Western big tech solutions. And in the end, we could also indicate that your army is a kind of a youth service that is not only a militarization vehicle, but also it can serve civic values, helping others, teamwork, leadership, supporting commitment to the common good, and so on. We could also indicate similar processes occurring in other countries. I will briefly mention in the case of France. France in the year 2019 introduced SNU, Service National Universel, which literally means Universal National Service. There is a name on the logo, which is very similar to the French Air Forces logo. You can see Je me suis engagé, which literally means you've engaged. And in this service, which is dressed in uniforms, but not that military style, a bit more sporty or police style, 15 years old are required to take part in a 2 weeks long boot camp where they train martial arts, drills, civic protections, first aid, camping, and they learn similar things to patriotic education, but without the nationalistic component, more a Republican style. And after this 2 weeks long boot camp, the service members are required to be volunteers for a period of 2 weeks in a chosen NGO or state institutions, for example, firefighting or rescuers. And if some of them want to prolong this period of volunteering, they can up to 1 year long. So this is quite similar to the Russian army, but without this aggressive nationalistic component. There are also discussions in other countries, for example, in United Kingdom or in Poland, if a similar solution for teenagers in this country would also be beneficial and successful. Well, finally, we will reach the security implications for Eastern Europe, and in our Center for Strategic Analysis, we like scenarios, because scenarios are thought-provoking, and we prepared two for you. One is really bad, and other is even worse. So the first scenario assumes that the current trajectory of events in Russia will remain, but because military effort is so costly, they will freeze the conflict on Ukraine, but let it remain and stagnate. This is a win-win situation, because on the one hand, Russia will limit the cost of war, and on the other hand, it will remain the presence of war for its internal means. Because we are at war, beside that it is frozen, we can expect that it could escalate at any time, so we have to be constantly ready for additional spending, and shortages and scarcities in our everyday life are somehow justified because we are in war. And it will lead to the new Iron Curtain between West and East. It will lead to the decoupling. Russia will be more dependent on the support from China, maybe from India. And it will turn into a new Soviet Union-style country with a full authoritarian regime, with total control, and so on. And what would be a consequence for the Eastern Europe? So NATO members that are located in the neighbor with Russia will experience a constant increase in military spending, probably a constant presence of NATO allied forces. There will be a further economic decoupling, and further increase in military spending, because there will be a situation that is similar to the one that is between North and Southern Korea. There is constant readiness and constant effort to be one step before a potential enemy. The only hope that we see in this scenario is that Ukraine could experience a similar trajectory of growth that is in the Southern Korea right now. That it could take this country to the path to the longer sustainable development. And now the even worse scenario, I call it the World Center. It assumed that because Putin's power will weaken, it will disrupt the present hierarchy of power in Russia, and because this country will be more and more militarized, it also will be more brutalized. So the violence will be perceived as a means for the political competition between Siloviki, between heads of an armed forces who will compete for power and control. And these Russian youths, for example, freedmen members who are basically pre-trained soldiers, could be also engaged in this competition for power as a private militia armies. And we are afraid that this scenario could escalate to neighbor countries, and there will be no longer a simple way to negotiate with Russia because there will be no one solid Russia. The chain of commerce will be disrupted, the economy will be disrupted as well. So there will be a huge potential for escalation and for implosion of international order from this point of view. Well, I passed my time a bit. I hope it's not a problem. Thank you for your kind attention. At the end, I would to sum up with two things. First is that remilitarization in Russia isn't occurring with tanks. It's occurring with pipelines. And the second thing is that in a highly militarized society, there is no clear line between wartime and peacetime. There's only a temporal ceasefire. And that brings me to the end. Thank you for your attention. I think we still have 10 minutes for Q&A, so I highly encourage you to ask a question, to share a comment, to express your disagreement. I'm very curious what do you think, so please feel free to comments.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious, especially when you introduced the Orthodox element. Does the UNARMIA, has its activities, how do they vary across the different ethnic groups in Russia? Is it primarily engage ethnic Russians, or how does the kind of UNARMIA curriculum vary across, regions in the Caucasus, or is it not really present in those regions?
Okay, so I've got a very short answer. We don't know. We are not sure. From the point of view of the official image, UNARMIA is very inclusive. Everyone can join. But we are not sure to what extent this is, in fact, it occurs. We don't know if there are any instances when someone wants to join and he is rejected because he's a Dagestani or he's a Burgat. So we are not sure. We don't know. Okay?
So I was wondering if there's any statistics or sort of a feel of the retention to the official army once the army kids turn 18. Is that something that is also not known, or
Sort of. According to the officially published data, 120,000 UNARMIA alumni joined Russian armed forces. But we are still not sure whether this is true. It is likely. It is very likely. For example, UNARMIA present incentives for potential members that if you join us, you will have a clear career path to the army, to the armed service, and for some Russian teenagers, there's also an incentive that they can go to the college, they can go to study when they are formally in army. So it is presented as incentives as a career path for them. Okay?
Thank you so much. Really interesting presentation. The question is, we're trying to follow the new members that join the army, and how they fluctuate. Because the war is ongoing, and it's still whenever public data is announced, it's quite surprising that still you have 100,000, 130,000 people joining because of the money incentives. What is your estimate, maybe you have data or just analysis, as to how does the war and the amount of basically the killed in the front line affects the way that parents would send their kids to the youth army? So that my question probably is that, the worse the war gets, does it affect or does it not affect? Because it is clear that people, for money, they still continue going and subscribing and ready to go to the front. But does it affect the way that parents feel about their children?
So we didn't conduct such an analysis. So sorry, but my answer is we don't know. We could only speculate. My speculation is that there's still incentives. There is still an incentive in the Russian province to join the army because the money that are offered to the soldiers is really far beyond the market competition. So it is still very attractive. When the UNARMIA members will become adults and they will be ready to enter the adult career path, I think in a few years the situation in Russian economy will be even worse than right now. That is right now because of the sanctions, because the growing number of shortages. For example, Russia is commonly considered fuel export hegemony, but ordinary Russians have problem with access to the gasoline in gas stations. And one last question, one last sentence, please. So I think in the next few years there will be no problem with entering Russian army as a way to just earn money for living. But would like to ask another question.
Maybe to clarify, so
Okay.
I understand that the incentive, the monetary incentive works for a person who is seeking career path. So, the person who makes a decision on his own behalf, if I don't have another vocation, so I go to the army just to get some money, right? Even if I'm going to die. In youth army, the decision is made by a parent about a child. And subscribing to an army, basically, in a way, you're not subscribing him for a vocation or money package, but you're subscribing him for future military action where he or she might be very likely killed. So there's a different thinking there. And, so my question stems, basically, if it doesn't affect, parents are not afraid that their kids might die, and they sit, at the same level, sending their kids to the youth army. Well, that tells something about as you said at the beginning, that receivable непонятно.
The only thing I could add to this question is that we are no longer sure how reliable is data from the Russian survey polls. Until, let's say, 5 years ago, Levada Institute survey polls were considered quite reliable. Right now, we are just not sure. And according to the survey polls, majority of Russian adults support the special military operations, their declarations. But still, we are not sure whether it is self-censorship. We just don't know.
Right, okay, thank you.
Yes, please.
Also, notice the trajectory of budget by year of the UNARMIA. I think it went down in 2023 and 2024 for doubling, potentially in 2025. What was the catalyst for doubling, and why would it decline in the early years of the war?
Okay, so the decrease in the spending on UNARMIA was probably caused by the mere fact that there are budget cut spending because of the war effort. And it rapid increase in the year 2025 probably is caused by the change in the way of thinking about the needs of the army, because massive mobilization for the Russian army is occurring right now, the second time in a row, and Russians changed their legislation, which now allow them to make a massive mobilization without formally being in the state of war. So it could suggest us that there is a preparation for preparing a massive infantry army, a Soviet-style massive army. This is my interpretation. Again, we are not just sure. Sorry. Please.
Thank you. I know this is not the focus of your study, but based on your research, what do you think are the main weaknesses of UNARMIA, and could we in the West use them to combat this activity?
Yes. So there is an interesting study conducted by Ilona Alava from the Helsinki National Defense University, where she analyzed social media posts published by the members of the Russian Independent Teachers Labor Union. And they say that there are many flaws in how this militarization occurs in schools. For example, there is no single structured way how teachers should behave. They've got general guidelines, but there is no, for example, formal regulation that can force them to act in a way expected from the authorities. So she described that there are instances where teachers use, for example, Aesopian language, where they apparently speak what the authority expects, but in fact they speak something opposite. And teenagers are aware of it. Another instance is that, according to Alava research, Many teenagers are just bored because of these lessons and do not listen to carefully, do not take part in this spectacle. So there are instances where, maybe let me say that, overall, all these militarization descriptions, in my opinion, tells more about what Russian authorities want to do than what they are actually doing. It informs us about their attempts, about their will, about the way they perceive Russian society, than what is really present in this society. We just don't know. This is some kind of estimation, very important estimation. The lack of necessary data and problem in interpretation shouldn't prevent us from such an efforts. So this is my take. Please.
Can you give a little bit of context? There's no doubt in my mind that these organizations like Boy Scouts have a value. But does this nationally proposed organization suppress the other youth organizations or divert people like church organizations or community organizations? Can you give a bit of an understanding of that?
You mean, does this organization suppress others in organizations in Russia right now?
Does the environment that this creates create the desire of the students to join only this because the others are diminished in value?
Okay, so I'm quite sure that on the Russian province there are no other alternatives for youth to join. Scouting in Russia is not well developed. It was limited because during the Soviet times the official scout organizations were just Komsomol and Soviet pioneers. So because of the legacy of Soviet Union, there is underdeveloped movement of scouts in Russia, in Ukraine as well. So there are no many attractive alternatives for them.